Hello everyone, welcome to Northern Aeronautical. My name is McCoy, and in this video I wanted to go over our recent attempts on trying to produce Mach diamonds with one of our 3D printed NE7 rocket motors. And so in this video I'm going to go over how we produce Mach diamonds with one of these guys, and what exactly a Mach diamond is, and the whole process of us trying to iterate one of these, which usually don't produce Mach diamonds, into something that produces those beautiful Mach diamonds. So I'm sure many of you might not even know what a Mach diamond is. And it's one of these beautiful exhaust patterns that you see. And I'll go over and how one of these form in a minute and what they exactly are. And they actually aren't efficient. They're not a good thing, and you don't want them normally, but they just look so good. And in my personal opinion, I think it makes a rocket look so much cooler to have these trilling out of the back of the nozzle during a launch. So Cameron and I thought, well, heck, we should probably try to produce some of these, because that would be awesome to have a model rocket produce Mach diamonds as it's lifting up into the air. It would look really cool. So we went ahead and tried that, and we actually produced Mach diamonds once unintentionally with our NE3 rocket motor. And that's a heritage rocket motor of ours, and it's actually pretty much the father of the NE7. It's kind of what we based all of our design methods on. It uses the same way how we calculate the nozzle dimensions. And so we went ahead and tried to redo that. And the Mach diamonds were hardly visible in the NE3, and we thought we could really pull it off with one of these. The results weren't as good, and I'll get to that in a minute, but we were able to produce Mach diamonds, and they might not have been the best, but hey, we were able to do it. So I'm going to go ahead and go over on how a Mach diamond is produced first, and then I'll go into exactly how we change one of these to produce them as well.
Okay, to explain how Mach diamonds work, I put together these graphics. So here we just have a plain and simple kind of very basic cut through view of a rocket motor. So you got, your throat, and then you got the nozzle, and then you got the chamber where you'd have your fuel. And this is the setup of a solid rocket motor. So once the fuel burns, it's going to create hot and high pressure gases, and it's going to be pushed through the throat of the engine. And that's where it's going to get super high pressure, and then it's going to go into the nozzle. And this is where it's super important, and this is how Mach diamonds are going to be formed. So the whole point of the nozzle is to increase the velocity of that exhaust gas. And the faster you can get that exhaust gas, the more thrust you're going to get. So what a nozzle does is it uses higher pressure as an advantage, and in the expense of that higher pressure, it can increase the speed at which those gases exit by expanding in such a way. So with that, it would sound logical to want to get as much velocity out of that engine as possible. And so you'd want to reduce the pressure as much as you can with that nozzle so you can get as much velocity out of it as possible. And that theoretically is the best idea, but then there's a few other factors that you got to take in place, and I'm going to go over that in just a minute. So let's go ahead and go back to where you had the fuel burn and begin producing gas to where it's going to exit through the throat. So right here, we have the arrow representing the gas flowing through the throat of the nozzle. And then once it passes through the throat, it's going to go into the nozzle. And as said before, you're going to want to use the nozzle to speed up that gas in expense of the higher pressure you got from the combustion of the oxidizer and the fuel. But things start getting tricky, particularly when you are in an atmospheric body and there's an ambient air pressure around you. You're going to want to speed up the exhaust, but at the cost, you reduce the pressure of it. And that's what causes some issues. So in a perfect nozzle that is expanded to the correct amount for wherever you are, the exhaust pressure is going to equal that of the ambient air pressure. And thus, the exhaust is just going to go straight forward. It's going to act like it's not even there because it's at the same pressure as the air around it. It's not going to expand, or it's not going to decrease because there's no force of it wanting to. And I included those blue arrows to represent that ambient air pressure. And because there's no expansion in either direction, whether it's inward or outward, because the ambient air pressure equals to that of the exhaust pressure, all of that exhaust is going to be transferred into forward momentum because it's all going in the same direction. And that's very important because you want to, of course, get as much thrust out of that nozzle as you can. And that's where it starts getting a little complex because, as said before, you want to try to get as much of that pressure of that exhaust with that nozzle into velocity. But then you want to keep some of that pressure in that exhaust so you equal the same pressure as that of the atmosphere outside the engine, so you can get as much of the exhaust going directly behind you, so it doesn't expand inward or outward. And that's what's so key about that expansion of that nozzle, is because you want to make sure that your nozzle is suited for the correct atmospheric pressure around you. And that's why there are vacuum nozzles and sea level nozzles usually seen in the professional world of orbital launches. And the sea level engines are not as expanded as much because you want to keep some of that pressure in that exhaust so it equals that of the ambient air pressure in the atmosphere. In that way, you get as much of the exhaust traveling directly behind the rocket. But then when you're in space, it's a vacuum, so there is no air pressure around you because there's no atmosphere. So you'll expand that nozzle as much as possible to try to turn as much of that pressure into velocity. And that's why the bells or the cones of vacuum engines are so big, because they're trying to turn as much of that higher pressure exhaust into nothing, so it's just all of it is converted into velocity. And then this brings up the scenario that, a nozzle isn't always going to be expanded perfectly. You're going to have some of the exhaust a higher or lower pressure than that of the ambient air pressure. And so we're going to look at a few examples of that, and there's either underexpanded or overexpanded. So let's say our engine example here is actually underexpanded. And so what would happen is that not all that pressure in the exhaust is converted into velocity, and it's so high of a pressure that it's higher than that of the ambient air pressure. And so what happens when you have a higher pressure in a lower pressure scenario? So you can think of like a pop can. When you open it, it pops because you have that higher pressure carbonated drink inside the can, forcing that gas outward because the ambient air pressure around it is much lower, so it goes to it. And so that would happen the same way in this nozzle. So it's going to be, that exhaust is going to be a higher pressure than that of the ambient air, and so it's going to go outwards because it's lower pressure in that area, and the air is going to be forced out of the way, and it's going to expand outwards. And that's what happens when it's underexpanded. And with that exhaust escaping off to the sides like that, because it's such a high pressure, you're losing quite a bit of force, because now some of it is being wasted pushing off to the side. And it cancels out each other because it's all the way around, but it's still a force going off to the side, which is taking away from that force that is directly behind you. And that is an issue with vacuum nozzles, because since it's a vacuum in space, it's actually impossible to equal that exhaust to zero, the exhaust pressure. And so you can only expand the nozzle so far, and it would actually take an infinitely long nozzle to get that pressure to equal zero. So in videos, especially when you're watching like a SpaceX launch, and a lot of people could make a connection to this, you'll see that some of that exhaust from that Merlin vacuum engine is actually escaping off to the side, and that's wasted potential and from the higher pressure escaping off to the sides. So what happens if our nozzle is overexpanded? So let's go back to our graphic here of just the basic good expansion level where the ambient air pressure is equal to the exhaust. But if it's overexpanded, it's going to do the opposite of an underexpanded nozzle. That exhaust is going to become such a low pressure to where it is lower of that ambient air pressure. So that ambient air pressure is then going to pinch it because it's a higher pressure, and it's going to force downwards because it wants to escape to that. So the opposite of a pop can. So if you were to open a vacuum of some sort, all that air is going to want to go inside because it's a lower pressure. But then something interesting is going to happen. And I should note right now that this also is seen in underexpanded nozzles, but I'm just going to use an overexpanded nozzle for this example, and this is what we're going to be seeing with the NE7 and how we overexpanded the nozzle. So what happens is that when that air pressure is then pinched down, because the ambient air pressure is higher, it will then go back outwards. And what happens is it then expands outwards, and it's going to continue doing this to where it produces that inward-outward pattern, and that's the very notorious look of our Mach diamonds. And even though it's less efficient because you are losing some of that gas, not going in a forward direction, it does look beautiful. And that's the whole point of why we wanted to do it in an NE7. And here's one of my favorite Mach Diamond engines, or overexpanded engines for sea level, is the launcher engine. And it uses kerosene, but in an oxygen-rich environment in the combustion chamber, and that's usually not seen. And it produces these beautiful bright blue Mach diamonds, and it almost looks ghostly. And I honestly, it's probably one of my favorite engines just because of those really beautiful blue Mach diamonds. And you see that the trail is actually really long, and then that's that ambient air pressure pinching it, and then the exhaust expanding out, then being pinched again, and it produces that shape.
All right, so now that I've explained how a Mach diamond exactly works, hopefully we're all on the same page. I'm no expert, so everything might have not been perfect on how I explained it. There's a lot more at play. There is a lot more complicated things to do with physics and all that, and I personally don't fully understand. Some of you might, and I'm sorry if I left some things out, but that's just my very brief and basic understanding of how these exactly work, and it's how I was able to produce them with my motors. So now that I've gone over that, let's get into how exactly we turn one of these things into producing Mach diamonds. So the NE7 is special because it's fully 3D printed. So we can customize it to pretty much anything we want, anything we can do in the CAD program. So we can extend it, we can change any dimensions we really want to. And that's super helpful because especially with trying to produce these Mach diamonds, we can easily change the size of the nozzle to be able to get that expansion ratio right to where that exhaust gas is going to become coming out of the engine at a lower pressure than that of the ambient air to produce, so we can produce those Mach diamonds. So in my hands right here is just the basic standard NE7. And it has the correct expanded, actually it's a little underexpanded, and I'll go into that later. I actually ended up figuring out how to produce even better thrusts out of these with trying to get Mach diamonds. But this is just the standard one that we've been using for a while. And so right here was our first iteration of trying to produce Mach diamonds. And as you can see, there's this massive change. It's taller and it has a giant shape coming out of it. And that cone is actually an extended nozzle. And that was in hopes to try to extend that nozzle out to try to get those gases to become a lower pressure than that of the ambient air. And I'll go ahead and show a video of that, and I'll show a photo of actually how these compare. So what you're seeing on screen right now is the comparison between the three NE7s we use. So the first one on the left is just the standard NE7 as I talked about in the beginning. And then the next one on the right is that next one I showed. It had that funky cone coming out. And then this last one, that is actually a bell-shaped NE7. And what we did was we changed the bell of the nozzle. Well, we changed the nozzle from a cone-shaped to a bell-shaped. And someone from a Discord server that we're pretty active on was kind enough to be able to run the calculations. We didn't know how to do that, and they were kind enough to do that for us. So thank you to them. And with this motor, we were able to actually produce Mach diamonds. And I'll show a video of that in a second. But these is the comparison between these three motors and the different sizes. And as you can see, they're much different sizes. And that last one, as I said, that produces Mach diamonds, is much longer, especially that nozzle. And you see that. And that's to allow that pressure in the gas to become lower than the ambient air pressure, and which would eventually produce those Mach diamonds, as I said before.
So let's rewind a little bit and let's go back to this test right here. And this test happened sometime in late or early January. This test most likely happened, if I can remember correctly. And this was a test of an NE3 rocket motor. This is one of our first times actually calculating the nozzle dimensions to the correct size instead of just kind of guessing it and test and then change things up to see if it fixed anything. But this was the second test, I believe, of this motor, and it does end catastrophically. It does explode, and some of you may have seen it happen already because we've posted on our YouTube channel or our Twitter. But the nozzle does produce Mach diamonds, and that's pretty important because it provided a lot of inspiration for these experiments now it kind of said, hey, you can do Mach diamonds with these solid rocket motors. So we went ahead and we're going to try this with the NE7s now. And that's kind of what this whole test did. And I'll go ahead and play that so you can see those Mach diamonds forming at the top of the nozzle. So if you didn't understand what I meant by end catastrophically, that's exactly what I meant. It completely exploded, and that was due to an overpressurization event. So obviously in the beginning, things didn't go so well. The motor flipped around, and that's because it was at an angle. And so it wasn't able to produce enough thrust to first keep itself up when it first started up. So as soon as it kicked the igniter out, which was keeping it up, it fell down the slope of the launch or the test stand, and then it was able to use that kind of angle to produce that thrust to flip it around, and then it overpressurized and blasted the end cap off, and which made that all that fire and actually tore that entire stand in half, or the rail at the top. But I doubt anyone actually would have been able to notice those Mach diamonds. It happens so fast, and it only happens just milliseconds before that thing explodes. So I'll go ahead and play the video one more time just to play it because it's kind of interesting. But then I'll go ahead and do a bit of a close-up to show those Mach diamonds. All right, so now here's a close-up shot, and here we have the motor, and this is zoomed in to where we have it at the top of the stand. And so right now, of course, we are seeing the top, and the motor hasn't flipped around yet. It started as we see the smoke, and it's falling down the stand as it's flipping around, and it is going to reach the top just in a second. So here it comes around, and it flips around, and now we have view. So it's shoving itself into the ground, and right before the explosion, some Mach diamonds are going to form. They're going to be super hard, so right before them. And I'll go ahead and show the singular frame that they were found in. So right in this frame, you can see those notorious markings from Mach diamonds. And I actually didn't catch this. Yukon from K9 Rocket Technologies actually was reviewing the footage, and he was like, whoa, dude, there's some Mach diamond in here. And I completely skipped over it. I didn't notice it. So that's pretty exciting that we have Mach diamonds in this motor, and we didn't even intend to do it. And I know it's not supposedly efficient, but it still looks really freaking cool. All right, so then fast forward a few months later, and right now the shot just looks completely black, but there's actually a motor in the background here, and once it fires up, it'll light up and you'll see it perfectly well. But this is going to be one of the trial run tests of the NE7. So this is when it was pretty late in development. We were getting pretty comfortable with it, but we just wanted to do a few more tests. And I was going to do one more test to try to see if I can figure out some issues I was having with it on the load cell. But in this test, I decided I would try to expand the nozzle a little bit more. Maybe I would produce Mach diamonds. It wasn't really the main focus of that test. It was just kind of an added extra. Hey, maybe I can add that because the NE3 was able to do it. So maybe this will do it. So I'm going to play the video in just a sec. But one key thing to note is that it doesn't produce Mach diamonds, as you'll see, or that I know of. And it actually doesn't even pinch, so that it doesn't, the exhaust looks like it's going perfectly straight, kind of expands out a little bit. And that tells me that it is expanded at a decent amount to where the exhaust pressure is equal to the ambient air pressure, meaning that the previous NE7 design, the one I was showing earlier, wasn't expanded out properly enough. It was a little under expanded. So meaning this motor right here actually is a bit more efficient. It has the exhaust more flowing directly behind it. And now this is our new, we're going to use this to design a new NE7 called the NE7E, and it's going to have some characteristics of this motor with that bigger nozzle for that higher efficiency. So it's kind of interesting how we were able to learn that while just doing some testing and also trying to look for Mach diamonds. So I'll play that video now. So as you saw, the test pad wasn't secured down well enough and it pretty much just flew away on me. And that's actually happened quite a few times. But anyways, the test went pretty well. There was no explosion. Usually I get overpressurization events in that kind of stage of testing. But luckily there was none. So as I reviewed the footage, as I said before, I realized that this is actually a better expansion ratio for this engine. And so I switched it over to the current NE7, but I was now more determined to make Mach diamonds. I kind of said, you know what, I'm going to just start producing NE7s just to produce these Mach diamonds. So I ended up making this ugly thing, and its whole intended purpose was I was going to expand it as crazy as I could to maybe try to get Mach diamonds, because usually whenever I just try to fiddle with it to maybe say, hey, maybe some Mach diamonds will come out of this, nothing really happens. So I went, just Hail Married it and all for nothing here, and I produced this motor. At the exact same time, though, I was also making a bell-shaped NE7 rocket motor. I wanted to see if there was a decent performance change, and I personally don't know how to calculate bell-shaped nozzles, but luckily there was someone on a Discord server that I'm active on, as said before, who was kind enough to calculate this for me and give me the dimensions. So with that, I was able to create this nozzle, and it ironically produced Mach diamonds when the heavily overexpanded nozzle did not. It hardly did anything really, and it was quite noticeable. There was a pretty big change in performance, and I'll show that in the video of the test right here real quick. All right, so I 3D printed both of those motors, and here is the ugly, highly overexpanded NE7 on its test pad. And that nozzle actually is so wide that it's at an angle because it wouldn't fit in the normally height motor mounts I have on the pad. So it's going to start up, and it moves the pad, but I have a thicker dirt barrier than I usually have in the back, and it shoves up against that, and you'll see that. And you'll also see that the exhaust does expand outwards from the nozzle, meaning that exhaust is a higher pressure than the ambient air pressure, but it doesn't seem, actually, I'm not entirely sure about that though, because you can't fully see all the way into the nozzle, and it might actually be producing a Mach diamond, and that's the expansion outwards, but highly unlikely, and I can't fully tell because I'm no expert at this kind of stuff, and this is just going off of the very basic knowledge I have. So the test didn't go very well. I actually tested this one last from the bell nozzle, but just for ease, I'm showing this first. But it didn't produce Mach diamonds. It proved the reliability of the NE7 rocket motor, but no Mach diamonds as I hoped for. So as you can see, that exhaust, it does expand outwards, and meaning that ambient air pressure is higher than that, or lower than that of the exhaust. But I just love looking at these videos because you can, since it is an orange, there's not as much dye in the filament. So when it's super hot inside or I guess super bright inside from the combustion of the oxidizer and fuel, you can actually see inside of it almost like it's clear, which is really cool to be able to see just the kind of movement of all the gases in there. It's not super visible because it's still colored filament, but it still looks pretty cool. And we have tried using clear filament. Cameron's done 1 or 2 tests using that, and it does look pretty cool. But now onto the bell-shaped nozzle test. that was the test with the bell nozzle, and it did produce Mach diamonds. They're not visible, and I'll go into why that is, but I just want to go over that this, yes, it does explode at the end. I messed up while fueling it, so how this works is that we hammer on a end cap on top of it to seal it, and they're just a little bit bigger than the actual diameter of the chamber within this NE7, so there's a good friction fit between the two if you hammer on that bigger object in that smaller hole. So the issue was that the printer printed a little too small, and so the end cap was just too small for keeping in all that pressure. There wasn't enough friction and pressure with the casing of the motor, so it blew off and shot the motor forward. The motor did survive, and it was in perfectly fine condition. It's happened multiple times with multiple different motors that these end caps just shoot off because they're not connected well enough. But back on to producing Mach diamonds. So it does produce Mach diamonds, and I'll go ahead and explain how I know this. It's on this particular frame where we can prove that there are Mach diamonds taking place. So I have that little blue arrow. It's kind of impossible to see because I have this cropped in a way so the exhaust takes up most of the room, but there's a little blue point, and that's pointing at to where you can kind of see where that exhaust slopes down. And from the explanation I showed, I told that the ambient air pressure, that's the higher pressure than the exhaust, pinches it, and that's what we're seeing right there. That exhaust is a lower pressure than the air, so then that air forces into it and pinches it, and we see it slope down inwards. And I'll go ahead and add in a little green mark at the bottom of it to kind of show that slope. So with that ambient air pressure pushing down into it and pinching it, I can pretty confidently say that there are Mach diamonds being produced, but you can't see them. And that's obviously the whole point of this, was to make those beautiful Mach diamonds, so you can see those patterns and see them trailing at the back of the rocket. And they're hardly, you can't even see those in this test, let alone see a difference in just the exhaust shape with just a normal test. And that is because this NE7 rocket motor, the exhaust is super sooty. There is a lot of particles in there, and they're preventing light to pass through, so it's not clear. And that's why you can see Mach diamonds in liquid engines really well. It's pretty much just all gas because the combustion is super efficient, and you can see straight through it. It's nice and clear. There's no large particles blocking it. But in solid rocket motor, and especially this one right here, at this scale, it's not the most perfect combustion, so you're going to have a lot of large particles. It's not all gas, and those aren't going to allow light to pass through. They're going to glow and reflect on their own, producing just that hue and not seeing anything. But then this brings up the question, why are you able to see Mach diamonds on the NE3 test? It uses the exact, or not the exact, but it uses Arcandy 2, and it's a solid motor. And it's important that I didn't say exact because the fuel was not exact. There was a major change between the NE7 and the NE3. The NE3 used sulfur in its fuel, and what sulfur does is it increases that temperature of that fuel. So by doing that, it gets those particles a lot hotter. It gets the whole combustion process a whole lot hotter. And what that does is it allows for more gas and less larger particles. And so it's much more clear and you can see through it. That's at least my explanation. If someone else has a more better explanation to why the NE3, you could see the Mach diamonds, that's my explanation, is that the exhaust was just a lot hotter because of that sulfur in there, so they're more visible because there is less large particles. And that is just kind of why you see, Mach diamonds in that, but no Mach diamonds in this. And that is unfortunate because the whole point of this was to try to produce visible Mach diamonds. And unless you look really closely, you can't really see them. All right, so that was our whole journey through trying to make Mach diamonds with our NE7 rocket motor.
we were successful, but they're just not visible. So it was a little disappointing, but it's still pretty cool that we were able to just experiment with these whole pressure, how pressure works in ambient air with then the exhaust coming out, and being able to kind of replicate what happens with real world rockets, where you'll see those Mach diamonds coming out of like the RS-25. And that's kind of the whole point, just to also trying to learn from this. And that's the whole point of making our own rocket motors. A lot of people make their own rocket motors because it's a lot cheaper, and that's kind of one of the reasons we did it too. But you have to add the price of the 3D printer and the development cost, and it really doesn't add up to really being cheaper than just buying commercial motors. We did this was to learn, and we learned a lot from trying to make these Mach diamonds. I personally kept learning new things and changing how I originally thought how Mach diamonds worked. It's a great learning experience to be able to do that. And so even though they weren't visible, I'm still pretty happy that I saw them. I could add sulfur and maybe see if I can increase that temperature to maybe get that combustion to be more clear, more transparent, so you can see those patterns. But I absolutely hate adding sulfur to the rockets because it makes it smell terrible. And the smell just isn't during the burn. It just stays and stinks for like months on end. I have to seal the motor because I just cannot stand the smell of sulfur in the rocket propellant, in our candy at least. And that's one of the whole reasons why I stopped doing the NE3, other than it having some overpressurization issues, was because it just stunk using that fuel. So the NE7 was born, and now I'm trying to make mock diamonds with that. Didn't go so well, but oh well. I learned quite a bit. I'm pretty happy with that. So that's just to sum up about this video. It was a long video, a lot longer than I planned on. I was thinking maybe 13-minute video, but now at a 30-minute video, which is over double the length of what I thought it was. I never imagined I'd do a 30-minute video in the first place. So thank you for coming all this way and watching that much of this video. I know some of I had a lot of explaining. Probably shouldn't have done as much explaining. So I'm sorry if I bore you. I'm gonna not do another one of these videos soon. I might have to do one for the NE7 video itself. Cameron and I plan on doing a very in-depth video about the NE7 rocket motor, but I don't plan on doing one of these super long videos in the near future. And I'm sorry for making it so long and it wasn't just quick and simple. It was too much explaining. But that's about the end of this video, and I just want to thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. See ya.